In 1848, a railroad foreman named Phineas Gage learned the hard way that you can't cut corners when it comes to dynamite. While blasting away rock to lay track, Gage skipped a crucial step. What happened next became one of the most unusual cases ever recorded in medical history. Gage was supervising a blasting crew in Cavendish, Vermont, helping carve a railroad track through solid rock. Back in those days, they didn't have a lot of heavy machinery. A lot of the work was done by hand. Blasting through boulders was dangerous but very routine. Drill a hole in the rock, pack it with blasting powder, add sand to prevent sparks, insert a fuse, tamp it down with an iron rod, step back, light the fuse. But on this particular afternoon, Gage skipped one crucial step, one that changed the course of his life forever. Blasting rock was a job of patience. The blasting powder they used was unstable, so sand was added as a buffer, which would prevent sparks when the tamping iron was used to pack the charge. Without sand, metal striking rock and powder could ignite it instantly. Gage knew this. He wasn't new to this job. He was considered competent and experienced. His crew trusted him, and that's why he was the foreman. But as the hole was drilled and the powder was poured in, something interrupted his routine. Some witnesses suggest Gage might have been distracted, like he was turning his head to speak to a coworker. Regardless, the sand was never added, and Gage lowered the tamping iron into the hole. As he tamped the powder into the drilled hole, the lack of sand caused the iron to strike the exposed powder. A spark flashed, and the charge detonated instantly. The blast was immediate. There was no warning, no time to react, no chance to step back. Just one wrong hit, followed by an instant explosion. The tamping iron, which is just a long metal rod similar to a crowbar, measured over 3 feet long and weighed more than 13 pounds. The blast launched it upward like a missile, turning a common railroad tool into a weapon. It entered Gage's face just below the left cheekbone. It passed behind his left eye, through the frontal lobe of his brain, and it exited through the top of his skull. The rod continued upward, landing more than 80 feet away, smeared with blood and brain tissue. For the men standing nearby, there was no question what they'd just witnessed. In 1848, injuries like this weren't survivable. There were no trauma units, neurosurgeons, no antiseptics. There was no ambulance or EMT crew on hand. A head wound alone could kill a man. An iron rod through the head would be certain immediate death. No one survives that. But Phineas Gage wasn't just any man. He took rub some dirt on it and walk it off to a historic level. Witnesses expected to see a corpse. Instead, they saw something far more unsettling. Gage was thrown backward by the blast, and he landed hard in the dirt. The crew froze, stunned, and the men watched in silence as Gage lay motionless. But within minutes, he started moving. Then he sat upright. He spoke. He recognized his coworkers. Witnesses watched, absolutely stunned, as Gage began to speak. Not only was he conscious, but he recognized the people around him. He looked around and he asked what happened. Blood was pouring from his face and his head. His brain tissue was visible. Bone fragments littered the ground. So Phineas Gage did what any man with a hole in his head would do. He stood up. He picked up his hat. He rubbed some dirt on the wound. He climbed into a cart, and he rode nearly a mile into town to seek medical help. By the time he arrived at the hotel where the local physician, Dr. John Martin Harlow, was staying, word had already spread. Townspeople gathered around, expecting to see a dying man. But what they saw instead was a man who seemed fine, as if he'd simply dropped a hammer on his toe. Gage walked into Harlow's room and he greeted him calmly. He removed his hat that he'd been using to cover the wound, showing the extent of his injury. Many historians suggest that Gage calmly removed his hat and said, "Here is business enough for you," as he exposed his pulsating wound, which was basically his way of saying that he was just giving him a problem worth his time, like he had his work cut out for him that day. Dr. Harlow later described the moment as surreal. He said he could see Gage's fully exposed brain visibly pulsating through the wound with every heartbeat. And Gage was fully conscious. He was speaking and he was aware. From a modern medical perspective, his survival borders on miraculous. But back then in 1848, they didn't know any better. There were no CT scans, no neurosurgery, no antibiotics, and no understanding of how specific regions of the brain functioned. What followed would become one of the most influential medical cases in history. Dr. Harlow knew immediately that survival wasn't likely. The wound was massive and exposed. Even if Gage lived through the day, infection was almost guaranteed. Bone fragments had been driven deep into the brain, and he'd lost a ton of blood. In 1848, treatment options were limited. Back then, medical treatments focused on cleaning the wound and removing loose fragments of bone. There was no anesthesia beyond alcohol and restraint. There were no sterile operating rooms, and every touch risked introducing more bacteria. Any intervention risked worsening the damage. Over the next several days, Gage's condition got worse. He developed a high fever, his scalp swelled, abscesses formed, pus drained from the wound. He drifted in and out of consciousness. At one point, he fell into a coma and was believed to be on his way out. And Gage's condition continued to deteriorate. But Phineas Gage had one more trick up his sleeve, and it was a showstopper. Pressure built up inside of his skull, and vomiting forced additional fragments of bone out through the wound, relieving a lot of the swelling. Over time, the infection subsided, the wound closed up, and the exposed brain tissue healed as scar tissue formed. And slowly, against all expectations, Phineas Gage started to recover. He had survived a metal rod shooting through his head. But survival was only the beginning, and it came at a cost. Physically, Gage recovered way better than anyone expected. He regained his strength. He could walk, speak, and work. His vision was partially impaired, but he was alive and he was functional. Mentally and emotionally, however, not so much. Something about Gage was different, and this is the part that's heavily debated by historians. But many accounts suggest that friends, family, and coworkers started to notice that Gage was no longer the man they used to know. Before the accident, he'd been described as capable, responsible, and even-tempered, but afterward, those close to him said he became impulsive, patient, and socially inappropriate. Dr. Harlow himself famously wrote that Gage was no longer Gage. He struggled with planning, he made poor decisions, he was prone to profanity and erratic behavior, and he lost his job as a railroad foreman. The shift in Phineas Gage's personality fascinated doctors. Until this point, the brain was mostly viewed as a single organ that acted together, but his injury suggested something much different. It suggested that different parts of the brain might control different aspects of our personality and behavior. His injury became one of the first pieces of evidence that the frontal lobes play a huge role in judgment, impulse control, and behavior. His intelligence remained intact, and his memory remained, but his personality was altered. His injury actually helped lay the foundation for modern neuroscience. Over time, there's evidence that his behavior improved. Gage would go on to work as a stagecoach driver in Chile, a job that required planning, discipline, and reliability, which challenges the narrative that Gage was permanently ruined. Instead, his brain adapted. Today, this ability is known as neuroplasticity. Phineas Gage went on to live nearly 12 years after the accident. He died in 1860 after suffering a series of seizures, which were likely related to long-term brain damage. After his death, his skull and the tamping iron that pierced it were preserved. They remain on display at Harvard Medical School's Warren Anatomical Museum. But they're not displayed as curiosities, they're reminders of how fragile the human brain is and how resilient it can be. Phineas Gage should have died that day in 1848. Instead, he lived long enough to change how humanity understands the brain, personality, and identity. The story of Phineas Gage isn't fictional. It's documented medical history, and it remains one of the clearest reminders that reality is sicker than fiction. This isn't legend. This is sick history.